You go with me. Those were the last words of a murderer, spoken with a firm voice, his gaze fixed on the eyes of a priest. The scene is tense, almost cinematic. All around, the heavy silence of death row, broken only by the sound of one's own footsteps. But what really chills isn't the place. It's what these words carry. Have you ever stopped to think about what goes on in someone's mind moments before they die? What makes a person choose these words as their last? You're going with me. Threat, confession, or the echo of a troubled conscience? Stay with me until the end, because what you discover now may surprise you. Throughout history, the last moments of convicted murderers have always sparked a strange kind of fascination, not just for their emotional charge, but for what they reveal about the limits of the human mind. It is in these final moments that the masks often fall. The true face behind the crime, the sentence, the apparent coldness emerges. And every sentence spoken, every gesture, every silence can carry clues as to what moved these people to commit unthinkable acts. Is there genuine repentance, or are we faced with minds that feel no remorse? When a condemned man faces his last minutes, is he thinking about death, or still immersed in the chaos he caused? Some ask for forgiveness, others challenge, some cry, others smile. And there are those like this one who say, "You're going with me." This phrase, spoken to a priest, a figure who for many represents hope, redemption, and even salvation, completely changes the weight of the moment. There is no peace there. There is tension. There is something deeper, darker, than the simple execution of a court sentence. What did this killer want to say? That the priest also carried guilt? That no one leaves unscathed? Or was it just a last attempt to manipulate, to scare, to maintain control until the end? Have you ever been through this? Have you ever found yourself trying to understand what is going on in the mind of someone who has crossed all ethical, moral, and human limits? Criminal psychology has been trying for decades to decipher the behavior patterns of these individuals, and often it is in these final moments that the most revealing signs emerge. Traces of narcissism, indifference, or even a strange type of internal logic that justifies the unjustifiable. There are those who say that at the time of death everyone shows who they really are. But does this apply to those who have spent their lives hiding their true colors? What if that gaze fixed on the priest, accompanied by the phrase, "You're going with me," is not just a provocation, but the reflection of a psychological abyss deeper than we are capable of imagining? Get ready to dive into true stories that expose the darkest side of the human mind. Let's look at the last words of convicted murderers, not just as morbid curiosity, but as a powerful lens for understanding what makes us human, or what keeps us from it. And it is from that moment that we begin to connect the pieces. Because the story behind these words is far from over. Let's look at what the last words of convicted murderers say, not just as morbid curiosity, but as a powerful lens for understanding what makes us human, or what keeps us from it. And it is from that moment that we begin to connect the pieces. Because the story behind these words is far from over. In fact, if this type of reflection makes sense to you, if in some way this story made you stop for a moment to think, comment below. Tell me what touched you most so far, or even what feeling this scene caused you. Sometimes we hear or watch something that awakens a memory, a discomfort, a question that had never been asked. And sharing this can help other people to see it from another perspective. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content that provokes, takes people out of their comfort zone, and makes us think deeper. When you like this video, the algorithm understands that it has value. When you sign up, you show that you want to continue exploring topics like this, without filters, in depth, with respect for the complexity of each story. It's not just a button. It's a way of saying I'm here too, wanting to understand, wanting more. And all of this brings us to an even more disturbing point. Because what this killer said to the priest at that time wasn't just a loose sentence. It was an echo of something bigger, something that perhaps we can only understand if we go deeper, further, to where most people don't want to look. It's hard to forget when you hear a phrase like that. You "You go with me," said calmly, looking into the eyes of a man of faith in one of the loneliest and most unforgiving places there is, death row. That wasn't just a dramatic line. It was a window, an open crack in the darkest parts of the human psyche. And it is precisely in this space between life and death, where there are no more escapes, excuses, or masks, that the crudest revelations, the most intimate thoughts, and the purest or most distorted traces of the true mentality of someone who committed the unthinkable emerge. Because it's one thing what you say in a court of law in front of judges, lawyers, journalists. Another, quite different, is what is revealed when time is up, when there is nothing left to lose or prove. It is at this exact point that the latest confessions gain gigantic weight. Not because of theatrics, but because often that is where the hidden truth comes to light, be it a sincere request for forgiveness, a cold provocation, or a disturbing revelation that has never been said before. And the most striking thing is that, in these final moments, the language changes. The tone of voice, the look, the breathing, everything reveals something. Many criminal behavior experts say this final moment can expose more than years of investigation or hours of interrogation. When the body relaxes in the face of the certainty of the end, the mind, however distorted it may be, tends to show what was hidden behind the scenes of consciousness. Behind the scenes on death row, time seems suspended. The routine is meticulously controlled, and each step towards execution is accompanied by rituals, bureaucracy, and most importantly, silence. Silences that weigh, that speak much more than words. It is in this space between what is said and what is felt that the true portrait of who is there emerges. And often what we find is not just coldness or indifference. In some cases, there is a kind of terrifying lucidity, as if the end had the power to rearrange the internal pieces and reveal, with cruel clarity, what has always been there, but hidden for years. Some murderers in their final minutes confess to crimes that had never been attributed to them. Others deny it until the end, with conviction. There are those who go into deep reflection and talk about childhood traumas, wrong decisions, and those who transform this moment into a last attempt at control, making death a stage. Each sentence spoken, each word chosen, carries an entire universe of meanings, because it's not just about understanding what was said, but about realizing because that was chosen as the last message to the world. This type of confession leads us to reflect on the complexity of the human mind. How can a person be at the same time cold and articulate, aggressive and lucid, remorseful and manipulative? Criminal psychology has been trying to answer this for decades, but perhaps the answer doesn't just lie in reports, exams, or theories. Maybe she is in that silent moment when everything ends, and what remains is a sentence, an expression, a final gesture. There is an undeniable psychological power in these last moments. They have the potential to completely deconstruct the image that was formed about that individual throughout the entire criminal process. And this raises a profound question. Do we really know someone by their actions, or just by the way they decide to end their story? There's also something unsettling about thinking about the impact of those last words on the people around them. The prison officers, the victims' families, the religious who accompany the execution. Each of them carries from then on not only the memory of the act committed, but of the way in which that condemned person chose to leave. Because there are deaths that silence, but there are others that scream. And the echo of this cry can last for years, reverberating in moral, social, and emotional debates that directly touch the essence of our choices and beliefs. Therefore, diving into these latest confessions is also diving into a journey of human discovery. It is facing the fragility of our certainties. It means opening yourself up to a transformation of perspective, which goes far beyond the crime itself. It is understanding that often behind the brutality, there is a mind in ruins, trying in its distorted way to leave a mark, tell a version, or simply not disappear in silence. Comment there. What do you think a last sentence can reveal about someone? There is something almost ritual about the last words of a condemned man. It doesn't matter whether they are said aloud, whispered, or written just before the execution. They carry deep symbolic weight. It's as if they condensed in a few sentences everything that remained unsaid throughout life. And that is precisely why, in criminology and criminal psychology, this final moment is treated with so much attention. It is not just the end of a violent trajectory. It is often the only moment in which the mind reveals itself completely, without defenses, without staging, without a script. At this point in the process, the lie has already lost its value. Manipulation no longer serves any purpose, and that's where things get serious. Because when a person knows that there is no going back, that each word could be the last, a clarity emerges that few experience in life. It is at that moment that masks fall and the truth appears, or at least a version of it that had never been shown. Some experts say a criminal's last words can act as a key. They open a door to what tests, interrogations, and reports cannot always capture: the real emotional state, the structure of thought, the way the individual sees the world and himself. No wonder there are entire studies dedicated to analyzing these moments. Universities, study centers, and forensic psychology professionals have already cataloged thousands of these statements in search of patterns, contradictions, and even signs of transformation, albeit late. The curious thing is that in many of these reports there is a clear attempt to control the narrative itself. Even in the face of death, some killers seem more concerned with the impact their last words will have than with the act itself, as if the final legacy could still be manipulated, shaped, directed, and that in itself says a lot about the mentality that accompanied these individuals throughout their journey. It is as if, until the last second, the need for dominance and protagonism remained intact. Others, on the other hand, completely break with the pattern they have maintained until then. People who were cold and impenetrable throughout the process suddenly collapse in regret, in guilt, in despair. And it is these disruptions that experts focus most on, because they indicate perhaps that there was a glimmer of consciousness there, a crack in the armor of indifference, a chance, and even a tiny one, that something has changed inside. The symbolism of this moment is so strong that, in some prison systems, there is even a specific protocol to document what is said. Trained employees are assigned to listen, take notes, report. Everything is recorded: words, gestures, silences, not just for formality, but because there is a growing realization that these final expressions can contain valuable information, both for understanding the individual and for shedding light on larger issues such as justice, punishment, and even the psychological impact of the decisions we make. And here is a point that few consider. It is not just the convict who is living in an extreme moment. Whoever is listening, whoever is present there, also carries this experience. Guards, priests, psychologists, witnesses, all of them, in a certain way, participate in this moment of revelation. And many report that what they hear there stays with them for years. Some phrases get stuck in the mind like an echo that refuses to go away. There are cases where the final sentence was a whisper of love, others where it was a scream of rage. There are those who made jokes, those who quoted Bible verses, those who made accusations, and there are those, like the one at the beginning of this story, who said something as enigmatic as, "You go with me." It is impossible not to wonder what exactly this phrase was intended to communicate. Revenge? Connection? Or just a final reflection of the mental disturbance that was always there? These last words are, in essence, a condensed portrait of that individual's journey, an emotional photograph taken at the exact second it all ends. And that's why, in studying them, experts aren't just curious, they're trying to map the invisible, the intention behind the act, the thinking behind the choice, the human behind the monster. This is a field where psychology and criminology intertwine intensely. Because here it is not just about diagnosing, but about understanding. To break through the hard surface of labels and look for what really drives someone to live and die that way. It is in this scenario that concepts such as trauma, personality deviation, behavioral disorders, and even the absence of empathy as a clinical phenomenon come into play. Each final word becomes a clue, a fragment, a detail that can lead to deeper discoveries about how the mind works at its extremes. And it is when we begin to observe this phenomenon not only with eyes of judgment but with eyes of analysis, that important reflections arise about choices, consequences, and the fine line between control and collapse. Because in the end, even in the face of execution, there are still those who try to manipulate their own image. And also those who for the first time let their guard down and face their own truth. Write it in the comments. What do you think makes someone choose certain words to die in? In that cold corridor, lit by a light that seemed paler than usual, time seemed to stretch. Everything was prepared for execution. Protocols had been followed to the letter, steps calculated, final words recorded. But then amidst the heavy silence that precedes death, the condemned man turns to the priest who accompanied him and says, in a low, firm, almost intimate voice, "You go with me." There was no screaming, no explicit anger. It was a whisper, and precisely for that reason, all the more disturbing. The priest, who was there to offer spiritual comfort, was surprised by a sentence that immediately shattered any expectation of peace at that moment. And it is precisely this type of scene that forces us to reflect. What is behind a statement like this? What hides between the lines of such a short, yet loaded sentence? A first possibility, which many psychologists point out, is projected guilt. The killer, perhaps unable to deal with his own responsibility, tries to share this burden with those closest to him. When looking into the priest's eyes and saying, "You go with me," he may be symbolically transferring part of the pain, guilt, or even spiritual condemnation, as if to say, "You've been with me this far, now don't leave me alone." It is an unconscious attempt to protect oneself from abandonment, to avoid the loneliness that accompanies the last seconds of life. But there is also another reading, perhaps even darker, symbolic revenge. What if, at that moment, the killer was not seeking company but rather trying to harm? The priest, as he is a figure linked to redemption and the sacred, may have become the ideal target for a final attack, a silent but brutal blow. To say "you go with me" in this context, it could be an attempt to corrupt the purity of that moment, to tarnish what should be a gesture of forgiveness, of humanity. It's as if, until the last breath, the desire will make an impact. Leave, an emotional wound, a mark. And there is also the third possibility, manipulation until the end. Many criminals with a narcissistic or psychopathic profile maintain control as a central element of their identity. Losing power, especially in a scenario like execution, is for them more painful than death itself. Therefore, when using a phrase like this, the convict may be trying to regain control of the situation for a second. He turns the priest into a character in his final scene, make it part of your narrative, and with that, he exercises his last act of emotional control over someone. It is important to remember that every word said in these moments cannot be analyzed in isolation. It is connected to an entire trajectory of decisions, traumas, distortions, and extreme experiences. And when we talk about that specific phrase, "You go with me," we are dealing with something that cannot be explained with logic alone. It's an emotional code, a distorted reflection of a mind that possibly always sought to be at the center of the stage, even if that stage was that of destruction itself. The truth is that there is no single answer to what prompted this statement. What exists are layers, one over the other. Some conscious, others not. Some built over a lifetime, others formed there, in the last seconds. And it is in this tangle of meanings that the complexity of the human mind in the face of death is revealed. Because sometimes a sentence like this says more about the desire to be remembered than about the farewell itself. It is as if, by symbolically dragging someone with him, the condemned man is trying to ensure that he will not be forgotten, that your name, your voice, your presence would continue to echo even after the end. The priest in this case became not just a witness but part of the scene, and this detail is fundamental, because it shows how even without weapons, without explicit violence, someone can try to invade another's emotions. It's silent violence, but extremely effective. And it leads us to question the extent to which an apparently simple gesture can carry deep intentions rooted in a lifetime of deviations and internal ruptures. Over the years, cases like this, have been recorded and studied by criminologists and experts in extreme behavior. They know that what is said at the end should not be dismissed as delusion or isolated provocation. On the contrary, in many cases, these last words reveal more than an entire investigation. They point to the type of mind that not only committed the crime, but that carried that crime within itself until the end, and that at the time of death chose to express it in a symbolic, enigmatic, and often disturbing way. Now that you know this case, comment below. In your opinion, what else could this phrase mean? The truth is that, as disturbing as the case of the priest and the phrase, "you go with me," was, it is far from isolated. There are dozens of records of last words spoken by killers who, each in their own way, left an emotional trail as striking as the crimes they committed. And when we look at these examples a little more closely, we realize how this final moment becomes a crystal clear and often unexpected reflection of the psychological journey of each of them. One of the cases that draws the most attention is that of Johnny Frank Garrett. Convicted of the brutal murder of an elderly nun, he always denied the crime. But, on the day of his execution, something changed. In a statement written before his death, Garrett listed the names of other victims, previously unsolved crimes, that he said he had committed. What shocked investigators most was the fact that some of these cases corresponded to open files, with details never publicly disclosed. It was no longer a simple attempt to confuse or manipulate. It was apparently a real confession, as if he, just at that moment, was willing to admit who he really was. And the most disturbing thing is to think about why this decision only came when there was no more time for any practical consequences. Would it be relief of conscience, vanity, or the last attempt to stay relevant? At another emotional extreme, there is the case of Carla Faye Tucker. Convicted of a barbaric crime, she killed 2 people with a pickaxe. Carla was for years portrayed as a symbol of female brutality. But his trajectory in prison underwent a visible transformation. She converted, became involved with religious groups, and began to constantly express deep regret. His last words were addressed to the victim's family, with an almost disconcerting serenity. She cried, asked for forgiveness with an emotion that many said was impossible to fake. Even though they were skeptical, several journalists who followed the case reported that there was something authentic about that moment, something that, in some way, broke the previous narrative. And the most curious thing is that, despite being a highly controversial public figure, Carla generated a national debate about the death penalty, compassion, and transformation. His last words became a symbol not of the violence he committed, but of the change he claimed to have experienced. And then, there is the complete opposite of that. George Appel. An old case, but one that continues to resonate. He was sentenced to death for killing a police officer, and just before being executed in the electric chair, he looked at the group of witnesses and said, "Well, ladies and gentlemen, now you're going to have some free electricity. I hope you enjoy it." The phrase spread like a spark. A macabre joke said with absolute coldness without any sign of regret. For many, it was an act of defiance. For others, a morbid humor that revealed the total emotional disconnection of someone who saw themselves as a character in a grotesque story. Whatever the interpretation, it is undeniable that, in that sentence, there was a kind of encrypted message, as if he were saying, "I don't care, not even now." An ironic cry from someone who chose to die provoking. These 3 cases, so different from each other, show how the final moment can carry deep and often contradictory meanings. Confession, transformation, contempt. In just a few words, each of these killers revealed a facet that was perhaps hidden throughout the investigation, the trial, and even during their time in prison. It is at this point that criminal psychology finds its most fertile ground, between the lines. Because it's not just what they say, it's as is said. It's the tone, the choice of words, what was included and what was left out. And when we look closely at these statements, we realize that they are not just the end of a story. They are, in many cases, the missing piece for the journey to make sense. They reveal fears, hidden desires, unfulfilled desires, And for that reason, each of them deserves to be listened to, not for glorification but for analysis. Because there, on the edge between life and death, is where the truth no longer has a filter. Now tell me, if you had to choose one last sentence, what would it be? And what would she say about you? There is something revealing about a criminal's last words. But what makes these statements even more fascinating is how they vary according to the psychological profile of the person who utters them. When we look carefully, we realize that the emotional pattern, or lack thereof, can be a window to understand, in depth, the workings of the criminal mind. And this is where criminal psychology comes in strongly, drawing lines between profiles such as psychopaths, sociopaths, and impulsive killers. Each person reacts in a very specific way to the end, and these reactions, however subtle they may be, reveal hidden truths about each individual's mental journey. In the case of psychopaths, for example, there is an impressive coldness even in the face of death. They don't usually show genuine regret or real fear. What we often see is calculated behavior until the last second. For this profile, logic continues to override emotion. Even when they express some type of feeling, there is always the feeling that it is performative, almost rehearsed. It's not uncommon for them to use the last words as a stage, a final attempt to control the narrative, to maintain power, to leave a mark. They speak as if they were still in control, as if everything were part of a game in which they cannot admit losing control, not even when they have already lost their lives. Sociopaths, on the other hand, behave differently. Although they also have difficulty establishing deep bonds, they tend to be more impulsive and emotional than psychopaths, and this is strongly reflected in the way they face death. Some sociopaths show regret, but it is a regret more focused on the consequences than on the suffering of the victims. In their last words, there is often an attempt to justify the actions, or even to blame the system, the family, the circumstances. It is not uncommon for them to mix anger, resentment, and a certain air of revolt, as if they were still stuck in a distorted view that they were in some way wronged. There is emotion, yes, but a confused, disordered emotion that has little to do with real empathy. And then we have impulse killers. Those who did not plan, who do not have a psychopathic history, but who committed crimes in moments of emotional explosion. This is the group that tends to show more signs of genuine guilt in the final moments. For them, the confrontation with death often serves as a kind of reality check. These individuals' final words are often filled with pain, not just for what is to come, but for what has been done. In some cases, there are pleas, visceral repentance, attempts at forgiveness that overflow with despair. And as tragic as it is, this is where a kind of emotional truth emerges that at any other time would have been stifled by denial or fear. The difference in reactions between these profiles shows us that the criminal mind is not a single block, but a spectrum. Each of these manifestations reveals a type of mental structure, a way of seeing the world, and of seeing yourself in it. Psychopaths are emotional strategists, cold and resilient until the end. Sociopaths are more chaotic, confused, sometimes self-destructive, and impulsive people are often marked by an emotional weight that only emerges when it is too late. It is at this point that psychology becomes an essential tool, not to justify what was done, but to understand what was behind it. And this understanding can completely change the way we look at crime, punishment, and especially the human mind when it moves away from empathy and dives into distortions that often began way back in traumatic experiences, broken family patterns, invisible realities that shaped behaviors to the limit. These final confessions, therefore, are not just loose words, they carry layers. They are like emotional codes, and whoever knows how to decipher them can see more than just the crime. They see the process that led to it, not to create empathy with the aggressor, but to identify in a raw and direct way how small decisions, environments, and choices shape a mentality that, in the end, is completely revealed when there is nothing left to hide. Now write it in the comments. In your view, is it possible to see genuine regret in someone who caused so much pain? Or would all this be just another form of manipulation? The remorse. A small word, but it carries a huge emotional weight. And perhaps no other situation reveals as much about the true meaning of this feeling as the final moment of someone about to die for a crime they committed. What happens at that moment is almost like an inverted mirror of the soul. Sometimes what you see there is true pain. In others, what you hear is just a performance, carefully rehearsed, tailored to make an impact. Distinguishing one from the other is not simple, but when you look deeply, there are signs. There are nuances that give away the hidden truth. One of the cases that most provokes this debate is that of Michael Bruce Ross. He was convicted of killing 8 women, and for a long time he demonstrated a cold, methodical, almost indifferent behavior. But in the final years of his imprisonment, he began to express clear signs of remorse. He apologized to the families of the victims, wrote letters, cried in interviews. Psychologists and journalists who followed him reported noticeable changes, not just in his words, but in the way he said them. His body posture, tone of voice, look, everything indicated genuine emotional exhaustion. The doubt, however, persisted. Had he really changed, or was this just an attempt at public redemption? This type of questioning is inevitable, mainly because there are countless records of criminals who, until the last seconds, masterfully staged repentance. And here comes an even more complex example, that of Ted Bundy. One of the most famous serial killers in history, Bundy knew how to manipulate. Charismatic, articulate, he used his intelligence as a shield and weapon at the same time. In the moments before his execution, he even admitted part of the crimes, but always placing the blame on external factors such as pornography or family disruption. He made emotional appeals, tried to sound remorseful, but many experts say that it was all just a strategy. The intonation did not match the content. The eyes showed no pain. It was as if he was trying to control the narrative until the last second, a cold signature consistent with his mindset from the beginning. And that's the most delicate point of this conversation. Remorse is not what it says. That's what it feels like. It is an internal, silent construction that cannot always be perceived just from the surface. A request for forgiveness, in itself, means nothing. What makes this gesture legitimate is the intention behind it, and this intention, no matter how hard it tries to be disguised, often escapes the details. In the time of silence between one sentence and another, in the choice of words, in the tension of the body, in the gaze that collapses or remains empty. But it's also important to remember that true remorse transforms. It changes the rhythm of speech, breaks the rigidity of posture, and brings to the surface feelings that not even the criminal seems to be able to control. There are those who say that when it is real, it doesn't need fancy words. It simply overflows, sometimes in the form of tears, other times in profound silence, but always with an emotional charge that is impossible to ignore. And in those rare cases, however controversial, there is something that looks like humanity. Now, bringing this into a more intimate perspective, what if it were you? If you were faced with someone who committed something unforgivable, but who in the end showed a regret that seemed authentic, could you forgive? Can you imagine what your reaction would be to a request for forgiveness from someone who destroyed lives, but who now seems unmasked, vulnerable, broken? This is one of the most uncomfortable and most revealing questions we can ask. This is why the final moments matter so much. They don't rewrite the past, they don't erase what was done. But they can, yes, shed light on what was never said sincerely. And sometimes this light, however weak it may be, is enough to leave a trail of transformation. Not outside, but inside. Because not all forgiveness needs to be granted, but the reflection it provokes can reveal a lot about who we are, and about the limits of our empathy. Comment there. Do you think someone capable of committing something so cruel can truly regret it? The moment of hearing the last words of someone about to be executed is something that surpasses any rational understanding. For priests, pastors, and spiritual agents, this moment carries a unique weight, as they are the ones who often accompany these people until their last breath. With every word spoken, with every gesture of regret or indifference, There is a deep emotional charge that resonates both for the condemned person and for those who are there listening. And for those on the other side listening to these final words, it is impossible not to wonder what it means to forgive, what redemption really is, and whether there is any value in those words that are being spoken. Imagine the position of a priest, for example. He is there not only as a figure of faith, but as someone who stands before a human being in his last hour. When hearing words of repentance, or even when the condemned man maintains his impassive posture, he must seek to understand not only the weight of those words, but also the inner process of the person in front of him. The condemned man's confession is often not just a matter of asking God for forgiveness, but also of trying to find some meaning in his own life or death. The priest at this moment serves as a mirror, reflecting the shadows of the human soul and trying to guide that being to a space of understanding or peace. Now, the psychological impact for anyone who hears these final words is something that cannot be underestimated. For those who listen, there is an incomparable emotional weight. When someone reaches the point of being sentenced to death, it is not just an act of justice, but a tortuous journey, full of suffering, regrets, and, in some cases, a desperate search for redemption. And the spiritual agent who is there, in front of this human being in his last moments, carries with him the burden of trying to offer what is most profound about him: the possibility of inner peace, the chance to alleviate the pain, to let go of something that perhaps has been carried by a lifetime of mistakes, or, who knows, a lifetime marked by coldness and cruelty. This experience is not something simple, and the testimony of those who lived through this process can be profound. There are stories of people who, after hearing real confessions of criminals in their last moments, came to forgive, but not before going through an internal revolution. One of these stories is that of a woman who brutally lost her son in a robbery. During the murderer's trial, he was cold and remorseless. But years later, the same woman found that man, already in prison, and he confessed in detail to the crime, expressing genuine regret, with tears. He said in his last words that he felt immense pain for the loss he caused. She then felt a huge weight in her heart, what to do with this pain. Forgiveness did not come immediately, but over time, she found space for it in her heart. This is the impact of the last words. They can destroy, but they can also heal, although not without a long and arduous process. On the other hand, there are those who cannot forgive. The weight of pain is so great, so deep, that even the most sincere confession is not able to erase the mark left by suffering. In some cases, the condemned person's final words may seem hollow, a last attempt to manipulate or conveniently apologize. And for those who listen, these words may not have the power to heal anything. Perhaps for some people, justice is not limited to words, but rather to actions and consequences. Forgiveness in these cases seems impossible. The criminal's final words may be met with skepticism, even anger. The pain that each victim carries is not something that can be erased by words spoken on the brink of death. And here, a crucial reflection arises. What do these last words really mean? Are they a genuine reflection of a soul's transformation, or just a last-ditch effort to ease the conscience of the speaker? For many, a criminal's final words may be the last attempt to humanize a being who was so brutally dehumanized by his actions. But for others, they may be just another facade, another attempt to deceive the world, or even yourself. What becomes evident when we analyze the reactions of listeners to these confessions is that the impact is always profound. In one way or another, those words reverberate in the hearts of those who hear them. They cause an internal shake, a questioning about what forgiveness is, what justice is, and what it means to be truly redeemed. There is no simple answer, because deep down, the journey that each person goes through when hearing these words is unique. It is personal, and there is no formula that explains precisely what happens inside each human being when they come into contact with such confessions. Now, how would each of us deal with a situation like this? What would you do, faced with final words so full of pain, regret, or even indifference? Forgiveness is always the most difficult answer, but is it sometimes the only path to inner freedom? Comment there. Do you think true redemption is possible, Or is pain something that never goes away? What this dark scenario teaches us, where the last moments of a life are filled with confessions, regrets, and, often, the desperate search for redemption, is a revelation about the complexity of human nature. How is it possible for a person, faced with the end of their life, to be able to reflect on their actions, ask for forgiveness, and even seek some form of peace? And on the other hand, how can someone who commits atrocities suddenly manifest such profound human fragility? This duality between evil done and the search for a kind of internal justice makes us reflect on the true capacity of human beings to commit monstrous acts while still being aware of their mistakes. Evil, when looked at closely, reveals more than a simple absence of morality. It is often a reflection of a complex psychology, full of layers that go beyond simple perversity. This complexity is what makes the criminal mind such a challenging enigma. Robert Hare, one of the world's most renowned forensic psychologists, has a disturbing view on this. He describes the psychopath as someone incapable of feeling remorse or genuine empathy. In Without Conscience, Hare explains that psychopaths have an extraordinary ability to manipulate the emotions of others, an ability that is not just a survival strategy, but a way of hiding their lack of emotional connection with others. For them, repentance may be nothing more than an act, a game to avoid the consequences of their actions. What's really alarming is that this lack of empathy doesn't stop them from behaving like human beings within certain social contexts. They may somehow understand morality, but they do not genuinely feel it. On the other hand, we have personalities who, although not psychopaths, still commit crimes with a disturbing conscience. They can be sociopaths, or even people who, in a moment of extreme despair or out of an irrational impulse, make decisions that result in irreversible tragedies. Gabor Mate, psychologist and trauma expert, talks about how experiencing trauma can lead to destructive behaviors. He suggests that many of these people were not born bad, but that their actions are a reflection of unhealed wounds, a lack of connection and emotional support throughout life. This reflection on human nature leads us to question, to what extent are we responsible for our actions? What makes us capable of killing, of destroying? And more importantly, what drives us to try to atone for our sins? Most of us live in constant struggle against our own mistakes, trying to find ways to redeem our own moments of weakness, of failures. But on a deeper level, what really stops us from going down this path of irreversible guilt? When we look at criminals, murderers who at the end of their lives seek one last act of redemption, we see human fragility on the surface. They are, deep down, just like us, people who have made mistakes, but who are, in some way, trying to deal with the consequences of their actions, no matter how complex or insane those actions may have been. It is precisely at this point that a great revelation emerges. Human evil is not a straight, clear, and defined line. It is made up of a series of intertwined factors, from the environment, choices, to the personal experiences of each individual. Evil is not something that is born from a single factor, but from a complex combination of influences. As Gabor Mate said, what is destructive is our inability to deal with pain in a healthy way. In many cases, evil is not just a conscious choice to destroy, but a reaction to untreated pain, wounds that have never healed, and often a lack of support and understanding. When looking at these individuals, many of us are tempted to see only monsters, people who are beyond redemption. But the hidden truth behind this is that they are somehow still searching for something human, understanding, forgiveness, the chance to be free of their own ghosts. And this search for redemption, however incomprehensible it may seem, is a reflection of our own internal journey, where we often find ourselves faced with wrong choices, impulsive actions, and mistakes that haunt us. When we reflect on human evil, it is impossible not to realize that in the end we are all dealing with our own duality, the ability to do good and evil, to struggle with our own inner demons. Now, this journey of reflection on human nature leads us to a deeper question. To what extent does society have responsibility for those who commit these extreme acts? Are we really providing the necessary spaces to heal the wounds that fuel evil? Or are we just judging and condemning without understanding the complexities behind these actions? Comment there. What do you think should be done to truly heal these internal wounds? Returning to the crucial moment, the tension-filled moment where the killer, about to face the end, looks at the priest and whispers, "You're going with me." What do these words really mean? Are they a threat, a plea, or perhaps a curse, a last attempt to pull someone into the abyss with him? This phrase, simple but filled with an almost palpable intensity, makes us question, how far can the human mind go when it finds itself on the edge of the abyss, facing the reality of its actions and the weight of the consequences? Could there be something even deeper behind this confession? Something we can't capture at first glance? And this is where the reflection becomes even more disturbing. This desire, or this imposition of company, is not just a request for forgiveness or an attempt to redeem oneself. Maybe it's the search for some kind of final connection, a desperate desire to share the weight of death, to make another human being, even if not at fault, also bear some of the anguish. Or, who knows, it's a way of wanting to take the other to the side of the shadows, so that death itself becomes more tolerable, more understandable, more human. This brings us to a crucial point. How would we react if we were in the priest's shoes? How would we interpret these words? Are they just the words of a lost man? Or is there something more there, something that transcends logic and hits us in an emotionally brutal way? This is the turning point in the emotional journey of anyone in a position like this, a human being trying to deal with what would be unthinkable for most of us. This interaction, as much as it causes us discomfort, brings us face to face with the dark realities that, to a greater or lesser extent, we all carry: death, guilt, remorse, forgiveness. All of these elements are intertwined in ways that we often don't fully understand, but that are somehow part of our own existential journey. We are always faced with the choice of how to deal with suffering, with error, with guilt. How can we ultimately find some kind of peace, of reconciliation when darkness surrounds us? And these questions, these reflections, are what lead us to understand the depth of the decisions we make in life, how the choices we make shape our own humanity, and how the line between good and evil, between redemption and damnation, is not always as clear as we would like it to be. We all carry within us the capacity to make mistakes, and sometimes even to make terrible mistakes. But is this the only truth about our nature? Now, I want you to think about this for a moment. Reflect on the different forms of confession we discussed here. Which one touched you the most? Which one made you question more deeply about human nature, about forgiveness, about justice? Comment. Which of these confessions impacted you the most? Leave it in the comments. And if you've been following along on this journey, please share your thoughts. What does this reflection tell us about how we should deal with our own choices and those around us? What do the weight of guilt and the desire for forgiveness really mean for each of us? This conversation, this dive into the shadows of the human mind, is not something simple to conclude. But it is precisely this complexity, this internal struggle, that is part of our search for understanding. And as we reflect on these questions, we prepare to explore more deeply the many ways our decisions and their consequences shape our journey. This moment of reflection takes us to an even more crucial point: murder, crime, the pain it causes, and the consequences it brings with it. These are the questions that provoke us to question human nature and the way we deal with our own mistakes, our choices, and our own shadows. The human mind, complex and often inaccessible, leads us to think about the limits of our morality, our ability to forgive, and often even to redeem ourselves. What makes us act in unthinkable ways? What happens in a mind that can commit atrocities and still find some way to justify its action? The case of the murderer who confesses his atrocities, who tries to redeem himself, or who, in a macabre way, still tries to manipulate until the end, opens up a range of questions that accompany us. To what extent do circumstances shape our choices? And, most importantly, to what extent can we change or free ourselves from these choices? The truth is that these questions have been explored by psychologists and criminologists for decades, trying to understand the tortuous paths that the human mind can take. As Robert Hare, one of the greatest experts on psychopathy, states, evil is often not found in a single moment, but in a series of decisions that, because they are so small, lead us away from our humanity. And this is reflected in the most diverse manifestations of human behavior, from a simple lack of empathy to the most cruel and premeditated acts. The psychological impact of all this cannot be underestimated. For those left behind who face forgiveness or anger, pain and loss, the scar left by these crimes never completely disappears. Many people are able to forgive for a reason that they may not even fully understand. Others, on the other hand, remain tied to a pain that never heals, never goes away. Forgiveness in this context is not a matter of absolving the action, but of seeking some form of relief for the soul, for one's own internal peace. But what about the person who commits the crime? The one who finally finds himself facing death with his life about to be taken, with the weight of everything he has done finally on his shoulders? The word remorse becomes the focus of an immense paradox. He who feels genuine guilt, who regrets, his actions may not find redemption, but he certainly moves towards self-discovery. On the other hand, those who try to act out this remorse, whether to gain the forgiveness of others or to appease their own pain, reveal another layer of the human psyche: manipulation, the ability to use others for one's own ends, even in the darkest hours of life. And when we observe these people, when we try to decipher what is going on in their minds, we enter a minefield. Every confession, every gesture, every word spoken in the final moment offers us a window into the workings of a criminal mind, but at the same time, reminds us of the fragility of our own psyche. How many of us, in extreme situations, would be able to deal with the weight of our actions in the same way? And most importantly, how many of us have the courage to face our shadows, to recognize the moments when we fail and still seek some kind of redemption? These questions, like an endless labyrinth, intertwine with the very essence of the human being. And the answer, well, may never be as clear as we would like. But understanding the complexity of these issues allows us to go deeper into our own journey of self-knowledge, transformation, and who knows, some form of understanding of the shadows we all carry. With that, one last question. What do you think about human evil? How does it manifest in you, in me, in anyone's actions? Do you believe that at some point we are all capable of committing atrocities? Or is there a line that once crossed separates us from our humanity forever? Comment, "That makes sense to me," or "I'm on this journey too." Any reflection on this topic takes us further in understanding who we are and how our choices can transform or even distort our essence. And remember, at every step of this journey, we are all trying to understand ourselves ever more deeply. If you've made it this far, it's because this topic has touched you in some way, and I thank you for following through to the end. I believe that we only delve deeper into subjects like this when we are really willing to reflect, question, and, who knows, understand a little more about ourselves and the world around us. If this content made sense to you, leave a comment saying what you think about this reflection we explored today. Is our ability to do evil closer than we imagine? Or is there a very clear line between normality and cruelty? Oh, and if you liked this video, don't forget to leave a like. It helps us to continue bringing this type of reflection. And if you liked the subject, there is a video here that further deepens this look at the human mind. Click and follow me there. See you later, and let's follow this journey together.